Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Georgia. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year is 1907. In a remote stretch of rural Georgia, in a sparsely populated county, far from the rail lines and major towns, a strange scandal was quietly brewing. Records are now scarce. Newspapers from the nearest county seat, Franklinville, refer briefly to mysterious illness and death in the settlement of Cedar Creek, but no detailed account was preserved. What survives are fragments, affidavits, a few letters from the state physician, a damaged ledger, and isolated oral testimonies whispered between older families. What follows is a reconstructed case file built from those shards. In many ways, it resembles the dark forgotten poison plots of Christiana Edmonds in Victorian England, though here in Georgia the context, scale, and local dynamics differ. We will return to her case later as a faint echo. The settlement of Cedar Creek lay nestled amid rolling hills and dense woodlands. The spring rains of March 1907 had been heavier than usual, and the creek's banks lay soggy. In that humid evening, a physician named Dr. Elias Marston arrived by wagon from Franklinville, summoned by anxious locals. He was a middle-aged man, clean but austere. Documents describe him wearing a well-pressed frock coat and his hat bearing the monogram M. The first impression he made, calm, efficient, formal. His arrival at dusk carried a quiet weight. Marston had previously practiced in the neighboring county of Jackson, and his reputation there was respectable, though unremarkable. County records show he once treated a child's diphtheria successfully in 1905 and canvassed for a minor rural clinic appointment in 1906 but was passed over. Locals in Cedar Creek, unfamiliar with his name, referred to him as the doctor from Jackson. He set up a small makeshift dispensary in the old mill house just above the creek, on land owned by the Waverly family for generations. The Waverlys were respected, though taciturn. Their family had held that parcel since before the Civil War. Mrs. Waverly, in a fragile 1912 affidavit, recalled that Dr. Marston first spoke of a tonic he would provide, saying it might help the people whose strength failed in the damp climate. Within days, complaints surfaced: lassitude, nausea, trembling lips. Several residents claimed their limbs felt heavy. In Reed's household, 3 became ill. Mrs. Reed died soon after, though the coroner's notes, if ever fully made, are lost. Rumors spread. Some said the tonic Marston distributed was tainted. Others said that Marston had quarreled with local landowners over water rights. Town gossip reached Franklinville. The county physician, Dr. Harcourt, submitted a terse letter to the state board in May 1907, warning of a cluster of unexplained afflictions concentrated about the Waverly property and the pond used for water supply. That letter still exists in fragments in the archive. Meanwhile, Marston remained composed. In one surviving letter to a former colleague, he mused, "I have yet to find the true agent of this malaise, but I trust the remedy lies not distant." He visited patients at odd hours, often by lantern, and kept a small ledger of syrups and elixirs. One Waverly descendant later claimed that in that ledger, beside entries marked "My Syrup," there was a single line, faint and smudged, reading "Compound Z, Caution." Those early days passed with no decisive action. Some recovered, others died. The settlement grew uneasy. Was their healer a savior or a source of ruin? By June of 1907, the people of Cedar Creek had grown suspicious of every vial and bottle that bore Marston's careful handwriting. He claimed his "My Syrup" mixture was nothing more than a restorative, a blend of sarsaparilla, honey, and a trace of iron tonic. But whispers turned to fear when livestock began to sicken near the same creek where he often disposed of his washwater. The few surviving letters between locals mention a sweet smell at the mill and the taste of metal in the air. According to an affidavit filed that summer, a farmer named Hiram Cates visited Marston's dispensary to demand an explanation. His wife had fallen ill days after taking the tonic, complaining of severe stomach pain. Marston reportedly assured him that the illness is the course of recovery, a phrase that appeared in several of his notes. Within a week, Mrs. Cates died, and her husband left town. His testimony, collected years later, reads, "I saw him that evening measuring from a glass bottle marked only with the letter Z. He told me it was the cure to strengthen the blood. I now reckon it was the opposite." The regional press began to take notice. A single column in the Franklinville Register dated July 4, 1907, mentioned a questionable medical practice in the southern county, though no name was printed. It referenced a traveling physician and suspected mishandling of compounds. No follow-up issue survives, and many later believe the editor withdrew the report under pressure. Christiana Edmonds' London trial decades earlier had left a deep mark on medical law, and her name occasionally surfaced in commentary among Georgia physicians during that time. In one recovered telegram, a state examiner wrote to a colleague, "We may have another Edmonds upon our hands." It is unknown whether he ever visited Cedar Creek in person. Soon, strange observations filled the local rumor mill, so me said they saw Marston burning ledgers behind the mill house after dark. Others reported a faint bluish smoke rising from his chimney long past midnight. The Waverly boys, teenagers then, claimed they heard metallic clinking and soft muttering from inside the old mill at night. By mid-July, no one dared to drink his medicine except the desperate or the unaware. Those who lived near his quarters described the growing isolation. Marston ate alone, kept his shutters drawn, and posted notices reading, "Closed for refinement of compound." When the town minister, Reverend Alcott, visited to inquire, Marston reportedly told him that he was on the edge of revelation. Weeks later, a wagon was seen leaving his shed at dawn, headed north, carrying barrels labeled "Syrup, Delivery, Macon." No record shows those deliveries ever arrived. The following autumn, the rains returned, washing debris down the creek. Children playing near the shallows found fragments of glass bottles, some with faded labels, "My Syrup," "Tonic B," and one with a crudely scratched skull mark near the base. The local sheriff gathered them in a burlap sack and sent them to the county seat, but the analysis, if performed, has long vanished from record. The people of Cedar Creek began abandoning the settlement. By winter, several homes stood empty. The old mill house doors were nailed shut, and the last surviving ledger page recovered years later would bear only one date, September 29, 1907, followed by the words, "All accounted for." By early 1908, Cedar Creek had become a name spoken with caution. The once busy settlement, where wagons once rattled across wooden bridges, was falling silent. Overgrown fields surrounded the Waverly property, and the old mill house loomed like an abandoned relic of trust, betrayed. Dr. Elias Marston was nowhere to be found. Some said he left quietly in October, taking his journals and whatever wealth he had gathered. Others claimed they saw him later that year near Augusta, disguised as a traveling apothecary, using a different name, E. Martin. No records of a license or registration under that alias have ever been located. The Georgia State Medical Board held a brief inquiry in the spring of 1908. The surviving transcript mentions only the Cedar Creek affair and a missing physician last seen distributing experimental tonics. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts. One, a farmhand named Lester Pruitt, testified that Marston often spoke of purifying human fluids, a phrase reminiscent of older European medical theories. Another, a widow named Esther Cole, said he warned her not to mix his syrup with creek water, though she swore that's what most families did. Her husband's death was attributed to unknown gastrointestinal distress. County coroner files, incomplete and water-damaged, list 10 confirmed deaths between March and September of 1907. That number may be higher. Many burials were conducted privately on family land without formal registration. Still, no charges were ever filed. The prosecutor's notes, kept in Franklinville until the 1930s, were later lost in a courthouse fire. The case faded into rumor, but among physicians, the comparison to the Edmonds poisoning in England persisted. The similarities, sweet-tasting compounds, victims of varying ages, inconsistent symptoms, gave rise to speculation that Marston had studied her methods in obscure journals before adapting them to his own formula. Though no physical evidence linked him directly, several details surfaced years later in testimony by a traveling salesman named Jonas Kearse. Kearse told a Savannah paper in 1910 that he had shared lodging with a doctor near Macon who kept a single bottle labeled Compound Z in his trunk. The man matched Marston's description, and Kearse claimed he fled one morning without paying. That bottle, if it existed, was never recovered. The tone in the surviving reports remains strangely detached. No one declared him guilty, no one proved innocence. The villagers had turned inward, preferring silence over scandal. The old mill was sold to a lumber merchant, its stone foundations dismantled by 1912. Locals said the soil there never produced crops again, as if tainted by something unseen. In a quiet note filed by the Franklinville Board of Health, an inspector wrote, "Water clear, yet the taste remains metallic." A century later, amateur historians revisiting the affair found a peculiar entry in the Regional Registry of Physicians struck from record in 1908. The name E. Marston appears with a faint annotation beside it. License withdrawn for cause undisclosed. Beneath that, a clerk's faint signature and the date, December 2, 1908, mark the last trace of him in any official archive. Those who lived long enough to remember him spoke cautiously. "He was no devil," one elderly witness said in a 1930 interview, "just a man too sure his cure would work." By 1909, Cedar Creek had become more legend than memory. A handful of families remained near the outskirts, their lives shaped by what they called the doctor's shadow. The mill house had rotted down to its frame, the creek whispering through the hollow foundation. Only the faint outline of Marston's workbench remained, scorched wood, and the smell of chemicals that no rain seemed able to wash away. A traveling photographer, visiting the area to document rural decay, took a single-plate photograph of the site. In his journal he noted, "The air held a strange sweetness, though nothing alive grew within 20 feet of the walls." The Franklinville Register never printed another word on the matter. However, one small entry in a state health bulletin that autumn mentioned isolated cases of gastrointestinal poisoning possibly related to home-manufactured tonics. Beneath it, a handwritten note added, "Cedar Creek Precedent, 1907. The story might have ended there, but that winter, new letters appeared, sent to the county board from Macon and Savannah. Each was signed only E.M. The letters defended Marston's methods, arguing that the illnesses were an unfortunate result of local contamination and ignorance. He insisted his syrup had been safe, his research sound, if misunderstood. Though unsigned beyond initials, the phrasing matched Marston's earlier correspondence almost exactly. Investigators traced one postmark to a boarding house near the river, but by the time they arrived, the tenant had gone. The landlady remembered him as quiet, pale, and fond of reading medical journals by candlelight. "He looked like a man who hadn't slept in months," she said, always staring at the bottles he carried. As months turned to years, the state's attention drifted. There were larger matters, industrial growth, influenza, new rail lines. Yet in the smaller towns of Georgia, the Lige, and persisted, the doctor who poisoned a village and vanished. Children dared one another to fetch water from Marston's Creek, claiming it still carried his reflection at dusk. When the church bell rang across the valley, some said it echoed like glass breaking. It was around this time that Professor Howard Lathrop of Emory College began collecting materials on American poisoning cases for a comparative medical study. Among his notes lies a brief reference. Georgia, 1907, the Marston case, parallels to Edmonds, England, 1871. Unknown compound, sweet carrier base, intent, uncertain. Lathrop's paper, later published in 1915, dismissed the supernatural accounts entirely, but raised a chilling possibility that Marston believed himself a reformer, not a killer. Such men, he wrote, serve the cause of progress with the hands of destruction. By the early 1910s, Cedar Creek had vanished from maps. A few stone foundations remained, overtaken by wild honeysuckle and vines. The Waverly family relocated to Atlanta. Their descendants refused interviews when journalists came calling decades later. The mill house itself collapsed in a storm in 1911, its remains swept downstream. Local workers clearing debris reported finding one intact bottle beneath the mud, its label mostly dissolved, save for 2 words barely visible in black ink. My syrup. In 1912, a traveling preacher named Silas Boone stopped at the ruins of Cedar Creek while en route to Franklinville. He claimed to have felt compelled to explore the site, though his reasons were unclear. In his diary, later published by a small press in 1921, he wrote, "The place was silent, as though it knew itself condemned. There was no sound but the wind against the reeds, and the faintest odor of syrup or sweetness still clung to the earth." His account mentioned seeing faint initials carved into a stone near the mill house, E.M., barely legible, worn by years of weather. Boone described it as if the doctor had marked the place deliberately, sealing a secret within its stones. He collected 1 shard of glass from the site and carried it for the rest of his life, calling it a reminder that good intentions may yet rot. The following year, the Georgia Medical Registry published a memorandum noting the continued absence of Marston. He had not reapplied for licensure, nor had any relative come forward to claim his estate. The land records list the Waverly property as abandoned and overgrown. Yet correspondence from a Macon pharmacist hints that a man fitting Marston's description purchased rare chemical reagents in small quantities in 1913. The pharmacist's note reads, "He said he needed them for demonstration at a school, though no such school existed." Christiana Edmonds' old case was again cited in medical circles that year after an English publication revisited her methods. The article drew attention to the psychology of poisoning for perceived benevolence, comparing it to similar reports from the American South. Some Georgia physicians took quiet interest, noting the resemblance in phrasing between Edmonds' letters and Marston's known writing style. Whether he intentionally mirrored her or simply shared her delusion remains unknown. Among the remaining residents near Cedar Creek, talk of the fraud doctor grew into something closer to folklore. Farmers told their children not to drink from standing water after rain. Women whispered about lights moving through the fields at night, dim lanterns swaying where no one walked. A local boy claimed to have seen a man in a long coat kneeling near the ruined mill house, examining the dirt like it was alive. His father dismissed it as imagination, but in later years admitted the boy's story matched details of a trespasser the sheriff had chased off that same night. In late 1914, a professor of toxicology named Dr. Walden sent samples of soil from the Cedar Creek area to Atlanta for testing. His report mentioned trace alkaloids consistent with medicinal preparation, though decomposition prevents accurate identification. He concluded the presence of such residue could only mean one thing. Something had been manufactured there in quantity. The official report was filed, but not acted upon. Marston himself remained a phantom. A census taker in 1915 recorded a boarded man living near the Chattahoochee River, age given as 49, occupation chemist. The handwriting was faint, smudged as though the page had been damp. Some historians later speculated it was him, still wandering, still mixing, still searching for the perfect tonic no one would drink twice. In the summer of 1915, a pair of surveyors charting the back roads between Franklinville and the Oconee River came across what they described as a derelict shed containing medical glassware, much of it broken. Their field report, archived at the State Survey Office, makes no mention of names, but a penciled margin note added later reads simply, "Possible connection, Cedar Creek." Within the ruins, they found several corked bottles with residue that smelled faintly of molasses and rust. One bottle, smaller than the rest, bore a paper label so faded that only the word compound remained visible. The men disposed of the glass afterward, fearing contamination, but they included one curious detail. The floorboards beneath the debris were blackened, as if scorched by some contained fire. Beneath those boards, they found scraps of a burned notebook. The words were mostly illegible, yet one phrase stood out: the formula complete. That autumn, a journalist from Savannah named Clara Eddington began collecting stories about forgotten Southern crimes. She tracked mentions of Marston through old registries and compiled a feature titled The Fraud Doctor of Georgia, which appeared briefly in the Savannah Evening Herald. Her article drew cautious attention, quoting elderly witnesses and referencing the notorious case of Christiana Edmonds overseas. Eddington suggested that Marston's motives were not purely malicious. He might have viewed his experiments as the final correction to impure constitutions. Shortly after publication, she received an unsigned letter written in neat, old-fashioned script. "Madam, I did not kill them. They killed themselves by fear and contamination. Truth will outlast gossip." No name, only the initials E.M. The postmark came from northern Florida. By 1916, the Great War in Europe had drawn most national attention, and such rural scandals were left to fade. Yet among doctors in the state capital, Marston's case remained a whispered example of unchecked ambition. One senior physician lectured students, "Remember Cedar Creek, science without humility is poison itself." In that same lecture series, the parallels to Edmonds' method were again invoked: the sweetness masking the sickness, the healer convinced of virtue even as bodies fell. The remains of the Waverly land were finally sold at auction that winter. A merchant from Atlanta bought the parcel for timber rights. When his crew began clearing brush near the creek bed, they uncovered a shallow depression filled with fragments of greenish glass and a rusted tin box. Inside were small vials sealed with wax and a folded scrap of ledger paper listing quantities beside cryptic initials TBLHER, believed to correspond to victims' names. No one could prove it. The ink had run. The box was turned over to the sheriff, who kept it locked in his office for years until the contents were misplaced during inventory. The few residents still living nearby swore that each year, when the rains returned, the creek water darkened unnaturally for a day or two, carrying the faint taste of sweetness. Some dismissed it as old soil leaching minerals. Others claimed it was the tonic resurfacing, the last trace of a man who believed in his medicine long after everyone else had lost faith. By 1917, the last tangible mention of Elias Marston appeared in a coastal medical supplier's invoice, a sale to a Dr. E. Martin of Savannah for small amounts of laudanum, chloroform, and glass tubing. The handwriting was tidy, confident, and notably archaic, similar to samples from Marston's known letters. Nothing further appeared after that year. The supplier later recalled that the man wore dark gloves even indoors and spoke with an accent he couldn't place, perhaps foreign, perhaps feigned. He had paid in exact change and left before dusk. The war years drew many physicians away, and the Marston affair slipped deeper into rumor. The people of Franklinville referred to the vanished settlement only as the poisoned place. Travelers sometimes stopped to see it, expecting a spectacle, only to find weeds and broken stones. A county clerk in 1918 recorded his visit in a personal notebook. "The ground feels wrong beneath the shoes, as if hollow." He described hearing a faint dripping sound, though the creek bed nearby had dried that summer. On Christmas Eve that same year, a small fire broke out in a tenement in Savannah. Among the dead was an unidentified man of about 50, found with burns across his hands and face. No relatives claimed the body. When inventorying his effects, the coroner found a notebook, the cover marked "Syrups and Studies." Inside were lists of herbs, alkaloids, and chemical ratios, most illegible from water damage. But one page, half burned, contained a phrase already known to investigators: Compound Z, caution. The body was buried in a pauper's grave, unmarked, yet the handwriting in the notebook matched samples from Cedar Creek's remaining records. The case file closed quietly in early 1918 under the heading Unconfirmed Identity. No further evidence connected Marston directly to the disaster at Cedar Creek, but his story persisted in medical folklore. In small county lectures, older doctors invoked his name to warn apprentices about overconfidence and untested compounds. They compared him, as always, to Christiana Edmonds, another figure who had blurred the line between cure and harm. To some, both represented cautionary tales of intellect turned inward, suffocating in its own certainty. By the early 1920s, Cedar Creek was no more than a name on a few yellowed maps. Roads were rerouted, the soil reclaimed by pine and vine. Yet travelers continued to tell strange stories. Faint lights seen moving along the old mill road, a scent of syrup carried on nights before storms, and the feeling, as several noted, of being watched by someone unseen when they lingered near the creek. Most dismissed these as the tricks of dusk, but those who had family buried there preferred never to pass by after dark. A WPA surveyor in 1936 noted the ruins again, describing a hollow in the woods, with foundation stones and traces of ironwork, possibly a mill. He added, locals refer to it as the doctor's place, avoidance strong, superstition intact. When the government proposed building a small dam nearby, the project was quietly withdrawn with no explanation. It was said the soil tests came back unfavorable. In 1937, a folklorist from Atlanta named Marion Dovell traveled through the region collecting rural ghost stories and superstitions for a university archive. When she reached Franklinville, she expected tales of the war and frontier hardships, but nearly every conversation led back to the vanished doctor. The locals still called him the Syrup Man. In her field notes, she recorded one account from an elderly farmer who said his grandfather remembered the doctor's arrival as a blessing turned to curse. He described the smell that clung to the mill house long after it collapsed, sweet but sharp, like medicine and rot mixed together. Dovell's transcripts offer one of the few modern glimpses into how the story had transformed. By then, the people no longer spoke of Elias Marston as a man, but as a cautionary figure, part myth, part memory. Some claimed he still roamed the woods, searching for the missing formula. Others believed he never left Cedar Creek at all, that his body lay buried beneath the ruined floorboards with his bottles. One woman told Dovell, "When the fog comes up from the creek, that's his breath. You can smell it, syrup and sorrow." Although Dovell dismissed the supernatural embellishments, she noticed that the story contained remarkable consistency in certain details, the initials E.M., the ruined mill house, the vanished patients, and the word poison scrawled on glass. Her final report to the university included an appendix with historical context referencing Christiana Edmonds, noting how transatlantic tales of female poisoners and healer-turned-killers shaped rural imagination. "Perhaps," she wrote, "Marston became our local echo of a broader dread, the fear that knowledge itself might sour." That same year, an aging clerk from the Franklinville courthouse, Walter Harbin, contacted Dovell after reading her article in a state bulletin. He claimed to have stored an old evidence box in his attic, salvaged before the courthouse fire decades earlier. Inside were 4 small items: a brass pen nib, 2 melted corks, and a thin scrap of paper marked "Deliveries, Macon, Savannah." Harbin died before he could deliver the items to Dovell, and when her students visited his home the following spring, the box was gone. The legend began to attract quiet attention among amateur historians and local radio hosts. A 1939 program titled "Dark Corners of Georgia" aired a retelling of the Syrup Doctor's Curse, dramatizing it as if it were pure folklore. The broadcast caused a brief stir, especially among older listeners who still remembered real names. The station received letters insisting it was no myth, that families had died, that the sickness was real, and that the government covered it to avoid panic. No proof ever surfaced, but the episode was never re-aired. Dovell's research became the basis for a 1940 anthology of rural legends. Yet even she admitted in her handwritten epilogue, "There is something different about Cedar Creek. It feels less like a story told than a confession overheard." By 1941, the story of Cedar Creek had become a local fixture, recited at fairs and whispered in schoolyards. The legend shifted again, reshaped by the fears of a new generation. Some claimed the creek itself was cursed, that it turned sour when touched by sunlight. Others spoke of a phantom doctor seen in reflections, bowing over invisible patients in the water. Yet, in between the myths, a few stubborn researchers still pursued the truth. One of them was a young archivist named Harold Kent, working under the Georgia Historical Survey. Kent was skeptical of the supernatural, but fascinated by unsolved rural histories. When he stumbled across the surviving ledger fragments from 1907 in the state archives, he immediately recognized Marston's careful penmanship. The ink was faded but steady, the entries precise, each patient's name followed by small dots, later interpreted as dosage records. In the margins, a single notation stood out: sweet base masks, metallic bitterness. Kent sent a copy to a retired chemist for analysis, who confirmed that the handwriting resembled laboratory notes. "Whoever wrote this," he replied, "understood dosage. Too well, perhaps." Kent's investigation took him to Franklinville, where the last Waverly descendant still living, an old woman named Ruth, agreed to speak with him. She had been a child when Marston came to Cedar Creek. Her recollection, fragile but vivid, gave Kent his most haunting line. "He didn't look evil," she said. "He looked certain." She remembered her mother saying that he always smelled faintly of sugar and smoke, and that he carried a silver watch engraved with initials she couldn't quite recall. When Kent showed her a photograph of an antique physician's watch found in a Macon pawnshop years earlier, she gasped. It was the same, she said, without hesitation. Kent published a short paper in 1942 titled "The Fraud Doctor, a Rico," an instruction. It was neither sensational nor speculative, but rather an attempt to anchor the myth in documented fact. He linked Marston's methods to period pharmaceutical trends, citing Edmonds' case as precedent. "Between misguided science and poison," he wrote, "lies only the difference of intent, and even that fades with time." The article stirred brief interest before vanishing under the weight of war news. Still, Kent's correspondence reveals that he received 2 anonymous letters in the months that followed. One read, "You write well of a man you do not know. He sought healing, not death. The fault was not in the tonic, but in those who misused it." It was unsigned, but the handwriting bore a strange familiarity, older, precise, and oddly formal, reminiscent of early 20th century penmanship. The archivist kept the letter, believing it to be a hoax, yet privately admitted it unsettled him. In a personal note written the night he received it, he penned, "What if he lived beyond the century he began?" Those were among his last words on the subject. Kent died in 1944 during military service, and his papers were boxed, misplaced, and rediscovered only decades later. Among them was a final draft of his notes, ending abruptly, mid-sentence. "The syrup was not for the sick alone. In the post-war years, Cedar Creek was forgotten again, its ruins swallowed by the steady regrowth of pine and kudzu. Only fragments of the old mill's stones were visible by the late 1940s. A road survey in 1948 described the area simply as abandoned farmland, unfit for agriculture. Yet beneath that quiet description, the locals still avoided it. No one built homes nearby. Hunters refused to camp there. The air, they said, turned oddly sweet after sunset. In 1952, a historian named Dr. Marion Keats, working for a small college in Atlanta, began cataloging unsolved poisonings from the early 20th century. Her research notes mentioned the Cedar Creek Tonic case, drawing heavily on Kent's unpublished materials. Keats was the first to connect several isolated death certificates from 1907 to 1908 in nearby counties, all listing symptoms consistent with alkaloid poisoning. Each had been signed by different rural doctors, but the handwriting on one certificate, the initial of a substitute examiner, looked suspiciously like Marston's. "If this is his signature," she wrote, "then the man continued practicing for months after the tragedy, unnoticed." Keats's work reignited academic interest briefly. A 1953 university seminar debated whether the case was an early example of medical zealotry, when the pursuit of cure erases moral restraint. One professor compared Marston's writings to those of Edmonds, noting the identical rationalizations, the insistence that the patients were improved, the dismissal of death as reactions. What set Marston apart, he argued, was geography. Isolation allowed him to vanish without consequence. Locals, however, had their own explanations. Some believed the creek water still carried remnants of his experiments. A Franklinville fisherman told a journalist in 1955 that he once caught fish with strangely colored scales, shimmering gold under lantern light. God. When the fish were cooked, the smell of syrup filled the house so strongly that his wife refused to eat. No one else experienced such a thing, yet the story spread fast enough that the state briefly inspected the creek. Their report was routine, noting only slight discoloration due to natural mineral content. Still, the legend endured. Each generation reshaped it. Marston as villain, martyr, ghost, or warning. Children passing through the woods claimed to see light behind the trees, said to be the doctor's lamp still searching for his notes. Others spoke of faint coughing sounds drifting from the reeds. Adults dismissed these as wind through hollow trunks, but they crossed themselves all the same. It wasn't until 1959 that a true artifact emerged again. A farmer, digging a drainage ditch, unearthed a small glass bottle, perfectly preserved beneath layers of silt. The label had nearly dissolved, yet 2 words could still be read when held against sunlight. My syrup. The bottle was sent to the county museum, placed in a locked display case, and labeled simply Unknown Compound, circa 1907. Visitors noted that no matter how clean the glass looked, it always seemed to carry a thin, oily sheen, as if the contents had once tried to seep back through. The museum still holds it today, though curators rarely move it. One, interviewed decades later, confessed, "Every time I touch that glass, I swear it feels warm." In 1961, the small museum in Franklinville that displayed the bottle experienced a strange series of events that renewed local unease. The curator at the time, Mrs. Eleanor Chase, reported that the cabinet containing the My Syrup bottle was found open on 2 consecutive mornings. There were no signs of break-in, and the locks appeared untouched. Chase later wrote in her logbook, "The air smelled faintly of sugar and vinegar." The local paper ran a small note under the headline, "Old Relic Disturbs Curator's Sleep," but most readers dismissed it as local gossip. Still, attendance at the museum tripled that month, and visitors claimed to feel dizzy when standing near the exhibit. The museum quietly removed the bottle from public view in 1962, placing it in climate-controlled storage, where it remains listed as Item 11B. Officially, the bottle's chemical residue was tested in 1963 at the University of Georgia. The analysis was inconclusive. Trace elements of mercury and plant alkaloids were found, but degradation over time prevented full identification. One of the lab technicians, interviewed years later, remarked, "Whatever it wasn't entirely medicinal." In the report's margin, another hand, likely the supervising chemists, added, "This aligns eerily with early poisoning cases." Cecil Edmonds, 1871. By the mid-1960s, Cedar Creek had become part of the curriculum for local folklore studies. Professors visiting the ruins described the site as haunted by evidence rather than ghosts. Photographs from that era show the remnants of stone foundations covered in ivy and a faint outline of where the creek once ran. A signpost was briefly erected marking the location as a historical curiosity, but vandals tore it down within a year. Some said they found the sign later, leaning against a tree near the old mill path, its letters blackened by fire. The Waverly descendants, Lon G. Silent, broke their public quiet around this time. In a rare interview with a regional radio station in 1965, great-grandson Robert Waverly spoke of family shame and enduring superstition. "My grandmother never said his name," he told the host. "She'd just whisper, 'The doctor.' Said he promised her people health and left them empty as graves. When asked if he believed the stories of ghosts or cursed water, he answered, 'No ghosts, just memory that won't dry up.'" That line became the title of a later documentary broadcast on state television in 1971. Despite renewed attention, no new physical evidence emerged. Yet the bottle remained a fascination for journalists. In 1968, a science reporter gained permission to photograph it. He later claimed that his film developed strangely, one frame overexposed with a faint human silhouette in reflection. The negative was misplaced before anyone else could examine it. The museum declined further photography requests. The story of Marston and his vanished village by now had crossed into cultural folklore. Musicians referenced it, writers used it as metaphor, and preachers warned of the syrup of pride. But for all its retellings, the real question persisted in the background like a stain. What exactly had he made? And had he truly believed it would heal? By the 1970s, Cedar Creek had become less a mystery to solve and more a mood, a dark corner of Georgian history used to remind students that progress often forgets its casualties. Still, in academic circles, the story gained fresh traction. Dr. Helen Miro, a historian of early medicine, published an article in 1974 linking the Marston case to regional pharmaceutical reforms. She noted that the 1907 tragedy coincided with the passage of the Pure Food and Drug Act, which outlawed many unregulated tonics. Cedar Creek, she wrote, may well have been an unrecorded catalyst for Southern compliance. Her work placed Marston's story beside that of Christiana Edmonds once again, suggesting both figures embodied the peril of unchecked conviction masked as compassion. The article drew interest far beyond Georgia. A British journal even cited it, noting that the ghost of Edmonds seemed to find a second home across the Atlantic. The link brought foreign researchers to Franklinville, hoping to find chemical samples or photographs. They found nothing. The state archives had long since misplaced the soil vials collected in 1914, and the only surviving evidence remained the sealed bottle, which the museum refused to reopen. One visiting chemist remarked to a reporter, "It's as if history itself has closed ranks to protect him, or us." Meanwhile, local accounts continued to circulate. Residents near the old creek swore the soil still carried traces of a medicinal scent after rain. In 1976, a young man camping near the site claimed he heard footsteps outside his tent at night, and a voice muttering something he couldn't understand. When he shone his flashlight, he saw no one, only disturbed footprints leading toward the water. The sheriff dismissed the account as imagination, but the camper left town the next morning and refused to return. The same year, an elderly woman named Cora D. Ian donated a collection of family letters to the County Historical Society. Among them was a brief note written by her father in 1907. "The doctor insists his tonic will strengthen us. It tastes of honey but burns the throat. I pray he knows what he's doing." The paper was stained at one corner, as though something had been spilled, dark, syrupy, long dried. In 1978, a local radio host revived the case for a Halloween special, presenting it as a Southern medical ghost story. He described the legend of the doctor who vanished, the poison bottle, and the faint lights seen drifting through the trees. The show ended with an archival clip of Robert Waverly's voice repeating, "No ghosts, just memory that won't dry up." Listeners called in to share eerie details, strange smells on the wind, reflections of a man in a coat standing by the creek, even laughter carried over water. The broadcast was replayed only once, after a caller complained of nightmares that week. The tale had survived 7 decades not through proof, but persistence. Even stripped of supernatural claims, its unease lay in what remained unsaid: the untested bottles, the vanished doctor, and the conviction that good intentions, once spoiled, never fully fade from the earth. In 1981, a new highway project brought surveyors once again near the forgotten edge of Cedar Creek. Construction plans required clearing a small forested section that, according to the old maps, passed directly over the former mill site. When the first bulldozer struck the ground, it unearthed fragments of stone and glass. Workers described a heavy, sugary odor rising from the disturbed soil. One operator, unnerved, refused to continue, saying later, "It smelled like something that should have stayed buried." The state halted work temporarily to perform an environmental inspection. The official report stated minor contamination consistent with decayed organic material, but an internal memo, unearthed decades later, admitted chemical traces inconsistent with natural decay. Afterward, the project was quietly rerouted, leaving that patch of land untouched once more. Rumors spread that someone from the university lab who examined the samples fell ill, though no record confirmed it. Still, the event revived local curiosity. Journalists revisited the case, blending fact and folklore until they were indistinguishable. One article called Marston Georgia's phantom chemist. Another described the discovery of glass-like veins of old poison, threading the soil beneath the highway embankment. None of it was verifiable, yet it captured the same unease that had shadowed the story for nearly a century. A historian from Macon named Philip Rowe used the resurgence to produce a television documentary titled The Fraud Doctor, The Poison That Healed. It aired in 1983, mixing interviews with grainy reenactments. Rowe stood at the edge of the overgrown creek, explaining how Marston might have sincerely believed his tonic curative, citing Edmonds again as precedent for delusional altruism. These figures, he said, did not kill for pleasure, but for certainty. The program ended with Toyot, the camera slowly panning over the mill foundation as Rowe's voice echoed. And in the heart of Georgia, certainty is still buried with the bones of the creek. Viewers found the broadcast unsettling, though it contained no explicit imagery. Letters poured in from people claiming family ties to the victims or to Marston himself. One envelope arrived without return address, containing only a photograph of an antique medicine bottle and a note written in old-fashioned cursive. He finished what he started. Experts debated its authenticity for years, unable to confirm its age. The handwriting bore uncanny similarity to Marston's documented style. In 1985, the Franklinville Historical Society placed a small plaque at the site. Cedar Creek Settlement, abandoned 1908, site of the Marston case. The ceremony was modest, attended by fewer than 30 locals. The mayor spoke briefly about progress in memory. A child standing at the back of the crowd later told his mother he saw a man watching from the trees, wearing an old hat. The mother scolded him for imagining things, but several attendees remembered the boy's sudden silence as the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint smell of syrup. By evening, the plaque was already streaked with a sticky residue no one could explain. The caretaker wiped it clean, but by morning it had returned, thin as dew, glistening in the light like amber. In 1988, the small town of Franklinville was changing. New subdivisions, chain stores, paved roads, but the shadow of Cedar Creek lingered like an old bruise beneath its surface. Teenagers began daring each other to visit the mill ruins after dark, leaving graffiti on the foundations that simply read, "Syrup Man Lives." A few even claimed to have seen faint light moving through the trees. One boy later confessed to placing lanterns there to scare friends, but his companions swore that sometimes the glow appeared even when none of them were near the site. The local newspaper capitalized on the fascination, publishing a Halloween feature titled "The Sweet Poison of Cedar Creek." The article mixed folklore with verified records, quoting old affidavits and referring again to Christiana Edmonds as Marston's spiritual twin. The editor received a letter in response, handwritten on aging stationery with elegant penmanship. "You write of ghosts and guilt, but know this, neither poison nor healer dies when truth remains unlearned." It was unsigned. The paper printed a facsimile of the letter. Older residents remarked uneasily that it matched the tone and phrasing of Marston's last known correspondence. The next year, a drought dried Cedar Creek completely for the first time in memory. When the cracked bed was exposed, relic hunters flocked there hoping for souvenirs. Most found only stones and rusted nails, but one man uncovered a small brass locket. Inside was a faded photograph of a woman and child, and on the opposite side, etched with careful strokes, the initials E.M. Experts later dated the photo to around 1900. Who the subjects were remains unknown. The county museum, still in possession of the My Syrup bottle, agreed to display the locket alongside it. When the exhibit reopened in 1990, visitors remarked on a strange optical illusion. Under certain light, the reflection odd. If the bottle appeared to merge with the image in the locket, as if the figures were standing behind the glass. A local paper photographer attempted to capture it, but every frame came out blurred, the faces indistinct. That same year, an elderly woman visited the exhibit and left a short note in the guest book. "My mother was one of his patients," it read. "She said he looked kind, like someone trying too hard to fix what God had already finished." No one knew her name. She left no address, only a faint outline of pressed petals between the pages. When the curator tried to remove them later, the petals had left a reddish stain on the paper, shaped almost like a thumbprint. The late 20th century brought television specials, paranormal investigators, and folklore podcasts, each offering their own version of the story. Yet in the town itself, most people spoke less about ghosts and more about the atmosphere. That thick, honey-sweet air after summer rain, the one no one could quite explain. Scientists attributed it to decaying vegetation, but locals insisted it was the earth remembering what had been spilled into it. As one old farmer told a reporter, "That ground's got a memory better than we do." In 1993, a graduate student from Emory University named Thomas Hale chose the Marston case as the subject of his thesis on moral psychology in early American medicine. Hale approached the story with caution, determined to separate fact from rumor. He spent months piecing together fragments from courthouse ledgers, newspaper archives, and the remaining museum files. His notes describe frustration at the inconsistencies, but also fascination with the clarity of Marston's handwriting. Even in his worst moments, Hale wrote, he never lost precision. The lines are measured, almost reverent. Hale's research led him to an overlooked document in a private collection, a letter from a county inspector in 1907 describing an encounter with Marston at the height of the illness. It read, "The doctor seemed pale and earnest, claiming his medicine was clean, but his hands shook as he poured. He said, 'They are sick because they stop before the cure is done.'" The letter's authenticity was later verified through ink analysis. Hale concluded that Marston's deadly tonic was likely an experimental stimulant tainted with mercury compounds, a misguided attempt to treat weakness and fatigue. Yet Hale's closing note remains ambiguous. If he knew it was poison, he wrote like a man still convinced it could heal. Hale's paper was published in 1995 to quiet acclaim, bridging academic history with eerie fascination. A documentary producer contacted him the following year, hoping to film a modern investigation at Cedar Creek. Hale agreed, though he later told colleagues that the site made him uneasy. The production team spent 3 nights recording footage among the ruins. On the second night, a microphone captured faint rhythmic tapping sounds near the creek bed, like glass gently clinking together. The sound repeated 3 times, then stopped. The producer included it in the final cut, aired in 1996 under the title The Poison Village. Viewers described the sound as strangely human, almost like a sigh behind glass. When asked about it later, Hale said only, "Some echoes don't need explanation." That same year, a severe storm swept through Franklinville, flooding low-lying areas and briefly uncovering parts of the old mill foundation. A local cleanup crew found small shards of frosted glass, identical in curvature to medicine bottles of the early 1900s. They turned the fragments over to the county, but no analysis was ever performed. The shards disappeared after inventory. Some speculated the museum took them. Others said they were buried again to keep the legend contained. In 1999, Hale revisited the topic for a lecture marking the new century. "The true terror," he told his audience, "is not what Marston did, but what he believed. Every monster in history begins as someone trying to cure a sickness they cannot name." The audience sat silent. A few days later, Hale received a package at his office, no return address, postmarked from Savannah. Inside was an old cork, sealed in wax, with a scrap of yellowed paper wrapped around it. The note read in faded ink, "Compound Z. Caution." In 2001, the story of Cedar Creek surfaced online for the first time. An amateur historian posted scanned documents and Hale's lecture transcript on an early message board devoted to forgotten crimes. Within weeks, dozens of users claimed to have visited the site or to possess fragments of glass said to be from the mill. The discussion quickly spiraled into legend-making. Some insisted the syrup had been an early prototype for a nerve tonic, others that it was a failed elixir meant to extend life. Hale himself posted a brief message under his real name. The tragedy was human, not mystical. The danger was certainty. He never replied again. A year later, Hale disappeared during a solo research trip through southern Georgia. His car was found near the old Oconee crossing, keys still in the ignition, trunk empty. Searchers discovered his notebook 2 miles downstream, damp but legible. The final entry read, "I thought I saw light near the water, a flicker like glass catching fire. It moved when I did." He was never found. The disappearance reignited national curiosity. Newspapers revived the story, once more comparing Marston to Christiana Edmonds, each an emblem of obsession disguised as compassion. Some speculated Hale's vanishing was unrelated, a tragic accident during fieldwork, but others found the symmetry impossible to ignore. Franklinville locals, uneasy under renewed attention, began removing old signage and discouraging visitors. The museum closed its Cedar Creek exhibit in 2003, citing budget cuts, though staff admitted privately that security footage had shown something unusual. On 2 nights before Hale's disappearance, motion sensors in the storage room recorded faint movement near the locked cabinet holding the My Syrup bottle. The footage itself was grainy, the shape indistinct, no more than a blur crossing the frame. But the timestamp corresponded to the nights Hale had requested private access to photograph the artifact. After the museum sealed the collection, interest faded again, this time not into folklore, but into avoidance. Professors who once cited the case quietly dropped it from syllabi, and the county tourism board requested that the area be left off official maps. The grounds returned to quiet, guarded only by trees and the occasional storm runoff that carved deeper channels through the earth. Residents nearby said the creek smelled cleaner in those years, though one fisherman swore the sweetness never fully disappeared, only sank deeper. In 2006, a graduate researcher cataloging digital archives stumbled upon an unmarked photograph uploaded anonymously to a university server. It showed the Cedar Creek ruins under moonlight. In the corner of the frame, standing by the old foundation, was a faint silhouette, tall, shoulders narrow, head slightly bowed. The figure's hand seemed to rest on something glinting faintly, a small glass bottle. Metadata placed the image at 3:12 a.m., with no photographer listed. The file was deleted within days, but copies circulated quietly among students who knew the legend. One of them later wrote, "I don't know what was scarier, that he was still there, or that he looked like he'd been waiting for someone to come back." In 2010, Cedar Creek entered a new kind of folklore, digital, fragmented, half academic, and half haunting. Videos appeared online claiming to show drone footage of the old mill site, though most were proven hoaxes. The real location had long since been reclaimed by forest, visible only to those who knew the curves of the terrain and the scent of the air after rain. Yet some clips contained strange consistencies, a dim glow by the waterline, reflections that didn't align with the trees. The most circulated of these ended with a single still frame, what looked like a handprint smeared across the lens, glistening as though wet with syrup. The uploader deleted their account within hours. Researchers at a local college revisited the archives after renewed attention. They uncovered a mislabeled file from 1907 containing correspondence between Dr. Harcourt, the county physician, and the state board. The letter described patients in delirium insisting the tonic was talking to them, whispering cures in their sleep. Whether metaphor or madness, the detail had been omitted from official summaries. The archivist who discovered the file later said he heard faint murmuring in the reading room that night, though he was alone. The discovery reignited quiet debate about what Marston truly believed. Some saw him as a cautionary tale, others as an early casualty of medical isolation. A man who tested cures in a world with no oversight, too convinced of salvation to see his own corruption. A modern toxicologist who studied Hale's surviving notes suggested Marston's tonic could have contained a mercury-based compound that caused hallucinations and tremors, blurring the line between healer and victim. "He may have drunk it himself," she said. "That would explain his disappearance, the letters, the erratic faith in the formula." Her paper, published in 2011, closed with a haunting line, "Every generation rediscovers its own Marston." Franklinville residents were less analytical. Some teenagers still dared one another to visit the woods, though the town sheriff began issuing fines for trespassing. Hunters reported hearing low tapping sounds, like bottles clinking against one another. One man swore he saw a flicker of light through the fog, a lantern swinging in slow arcs near the creek. When asked to describe it, he said, "It wasn't the light that scared me. It was the smell, like sugar burning." The last public exhibition of any Cedar Creek artifact occurred in 2013 at a university conference on Southern folklore. The My Syrup bottle was displayed behind bulletproof glass. On the final night of the exhibit, condensation formed inside the sealed case, fogging the label completely. The temperature of the room was stable, yet the glass remained misted until morning. When cleaned, a faint ring was discovered at the base, dark, circular, shaped like a thumb pressed into wet varnish. No one could tell if it had been there before. The museum archived it again under stricter conditions, noting only, "No visible degradation, residue persistent."